Welcome to the Unveiled Epic Echoes channel. Today, we're diving deep into an unexplored historical mystery. In the winter of 1957, when the wind along the eastern seaboard of the United States moved through bare trees with a whisper that sounded almost like breath, a man stepped off a late-night passenger train in a town that had never appeared on most maps and carried with him nothing but a suitcase made of dark leather and a name that no one could verify. And though the station master would later swear that he had watched every passenger descend from the cars that night, none of them seemed to remember the moment the man first appeared beneath the yellow lamplight, as snow fell quietly around his shoes and gathered in the seams of his coat. And when asked where he had come from, he spoke in an accent that drifted in and out of familiarity as though it belonged to no single place, but echoed with the faint cadence of somewhere older than memory, telling the curious conductor that his name was Daniel, and that he had arrived in America to find something he had lost long ago. Though when pressed about what that something was, he simply smiled in a way that suggested the answer would only create more questions than it resolved. And in the days that followed, his presence settled into the small town like a second shadow cast by the fading light of winter afternoons, as he rented a narrow room above the general store and spent long hours walking the outskirts of the riverbank, where the ice cracked softly against the shore. And it was there that the local librarian first noticed him studying the crumbling foundation stones of an abandoned mill that had burned down decades earlier under circumstances no one had ever quite explained. And though Daniel never claimed to know anything about the fire, he asked the librarian for records dating back to the early colonial period, requesting documents written in long-forgotten dialects and maps that showed settlements which had vanished before the Civil War had ever begun. And as the weeks passed, it became clear that he possessed an uncanny ability to read languages that had not been spoken aloud in centuries, tracing the faded ink of ship manifests and land grants with careful fingers, as though reacquainting himself with something he had once known by heart. And when the librarian asked how he had learned such things, Daniel admitted only that he had spent much of his life searching for places that no longer existed, and that America was filled with stories buried so deeply beneath the weight of progress that even the people who lived above them had forgotten what lay beneath their foundations. And though his words were spoken gently, they carried with them a quiet certainty that unsettled those who heard them. Especially when he began to speak of a settlement founded sometime in the late 17th century by a group of travelers who arrived not by sea, but by a route no surviving record described. And according to the fragmented journals, he unearthed these travelers brought with them a stone tablet etched in symbols that predated any known alphabet used by European settlers of the time. And while most historians had dismissed the account as folklore, Daniel insisted that the references were consistent across multiple documents, separated by decades and counties, and even state lines. And his research soon drew the attention of a retired professor who had spent years cataloging local myths about missing towns and roads that once led to nowhere. And together, they began to piece together a narrative suggesting that the abandoned mill had been constructed atop the ruins of a much older structure, whose existence had been intentionally erased from official surveys sometime in the early 19th century. And as spring thawed the frozen earth, Daniel persuaded the professor to help him excavate the site beneath the mill's foundation, where, after days of careful digging, they uncovered a stone archway leading into a narrow chamber whose walls were marked with the same unfamiliar symbols described in the journals. And though the professor urged caution, Daniel descended into the darkness with a lantern in hand and found at the chamber's center a pedestal upon which rested a fragment of polished stone that seemed to hum faintly when touched. And as his fingers brushed its surface, memories stirred within him that he could neither explain nor deny. Visions of a coastline untouched by industry and of voices speaking in tones that reverberated with the weight of forgotten centuries. And in that moment, Daniel understood that his search had not been for a place, but for proof that he himself had once been part of a story erased from history. And when he emerged from the chamber, his eyes reflected the lantern's light in a way that made the professor step back in quiet alarm. And over the following nights, Daniel revealed that he had no memory of his life before arriving in America, beyond a recurring dream of a settlement built by those who believed the land itself could remember what humanity chose to forget, and that the stone fragment had been created not as a monument, but as a record designed to endure even when all written accounts were destroyed. And though the professor struggled to accept such claims, he could not deny the way Daniel's presence seemed to align with the rediscovery of the chamber, as though time itself had drawn him there. And as word of their findings spread, officials arrived to seal off the site, citing safety concerns and historical preservation laws. Yet Daniel vanished before they could question him further, leaving behind only the leather suitcase in his rented room, where inside they found maps marked with routes that intersected at towns long since abandoned and notes written in a script no one could decipher. And on the final page, a single sentence appeared in careful handwriting stating that history was not a line, but a circle, and that some stories waited centuries for their missing pieces to return. And though the chamber beneath the mill was eventually filled in, and the professor's reports were archived without public release, the town's residents would later recall the winter when a man with no past arrived and walked along the frozen riverbank as though listening for something beneath the ice. And in quiet moments, they wondered whether Daniel had come to America in search of history, or whether history itself had summoned him back to complete a memory it had never entirely lost. And though the years would pass without further sign of him, travelers occasionally reported seeing a figure standing near the ruins of forgotten settlements, gazing toward the horizon with a familiarity that suggested he had once known the land before it bore any name at all. And in the hush of late evenings, when the wind carried the scent of thawing earth across empty fields, some swore they could hear the faint echo of symbols etched into stone, whispering stories too old to be written yet too important to disappear entirely, reminding those who listened that the past does not vanish, but merely waits beneath the surface for someone willing to remember. This mysterious journey ends here, but stay tuned for more untold stories in our next video. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Thank you, and see you again.